February 1943, Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The morning sun creeps over a torn landscape of sand and smoke. The desert wind howls through twisted steel and shattered dreams. Across the valley, American tanks burn like torches, their black smoke staining the horizon. The ground is littered with helmets, rifles, and lifeless bodies half buried in dust. The smell of oil, gunpowder, and blood hangs heavy in the air. This is where the US Army faces its first true trial of war. Green, untested soldiers of the United States Second Corps meet Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, and his ruthless Afrika Korps, men hardened by years of desert warfare. The Germans come armed with Panzer IVs and the monstrous Tiger Rhine tanks, their 88mm guns shredding American armour with ease. The Americans fight back with M3 Stuarts and M4 Shermans, their 37mm and 75mm shells bouncing helplessly off thick German plates. Each hit on a Sherman ignites it instantly, earning the grim nickname Ronson because it lights every time. Machine guns rattle, mortars shriek. The desert becomes a furnace of smoke and flying metal. Whole platoons vanish under artillery fire. Radios crackle with confusion. Officers scream over static trying to reach headquarters buried 80 miles behind the lines. Panic spreads like wildfire through the ranks as men stumble through dust and flame, searching for cover that doesn't exist. By nightfall, the once proud valley of Kasserine has become a graveyard of twisted armour and burning wrecks. Nearly 200 vehicles lie destroyed across the sand. More than 2,000 Americans are dead, missing, or captured. Rommel surveys the field through his binoculars and says quietly, "The Americans are brave, but so very green." In the days that followed, the Allies would lose nearly 10,000 men. 6,500 Americans killed, thousands more wounded or captured. 183 tanks, 194 half-tracks, 208 artillery pieces, and over 500 trucks and jeeps lay scattered across Tunisia. The German toll was lighter, about 2,000 casualties, but their triumph was hollow. Rommel's army, starving for fuel and ammunition, would soon be forced to retreat toward Tunisia's coast. He had proven his brilliance one last time, but he could not hold what he had taken. This was no ordinary defeat, it was a harsh lesson. Before the Allies could triumph in Europe, before they could storm Normandy's beaches, they would first have to survive this place. In the desert winds of Tunisia, amid smoke and sand, America's army was baptized in fire, and from the ashes of Chaos Pass, a new kind of soldier would rise. Far from the front lines, inside a maze of sand-coloured hills near Tebessa, a messenger bursts into the tent of Brigadier General Paul Robinett. In his hand, a note from headquarters, written in cryptic language that sounds more like a riddle than a military order. Robinett stares at it in disbelief. The message, meant to be secure, is so garbled it would take as long for the Germans to decipher it as it does his own staff. But confusion is nothing new under Major General Lloyd Fredendall, commander of the United States Second Corps, a man whose leadership will soon define the word chaos. Fredendall operates from an underground fortress he's built 80 miles behind the fighting. He calls it Speedy Valley. Soldiers call it Lloyd's very last resort. Thousands of engineers have spent weeks carving the tunnels and concrete chambers where Fredendall hides, barking orders through telephones and radios to units he's never seen, on terrain he's never visited. He's a man of contradictions, sharp-tongued, fiercely arrogant, and distrustful of his British allies. He hurls insults at subordinates, ignores intelligence reports, and refuses to remove pro-Vichy French officers from key posts. While his men dig bunkers in the rear, the front lines remain dangerously exposed. The 1st Armoured Division, America's pride, has never trained in desert combat. Its radios, borrowed from the Connecticut State Police, barely function across the dunes. Units are scattered, artillery is misplaced, and the soldiers don't even hold the high ground. Fredendall's British superior, Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson, adds to the dysfunction, a dour man known by the codename Sunray, who commands with cold detachment. Between them stand the French, under-equipped and resentful, their cooperation with the Allies fragile at best. Every order from headquarters breeds more confusion. Communications crackle, maps are wrong, and officers spend hours arguing over positions instead of preparing defences. It is a war fought by paperwork and personality, not by discipline and unity. As the German forces prepare to strike through Tunisia's mountain passes, American soldiers at the front wait for direction that never comes. The enemy is organised, unified, and deadly efficient. The Allies are divided, unsure, and led by men more focused on procedure than survival. In the vast desert silence, as night falls over Kasserine, one truth becomes clear. The greatest danger to the US Army may not be Rommel's tanks, but the chaos within its own command. While confusion and arrogance plagued the Allied command, the Axis forces moved with brutal precision. Across the sands of Tunisia, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and Colonel General Jürgen von Arnim were forming a deadly pincer. To the north, von Arnim's 5th Panzer Army gathered near Field Pass. To the south, Rommel's Afrika Korps, veterans of El Alamein and Tobruk, regrouped for one last strike. Their plan was elegant and ruthless, a double envelopment that would crush the Americans in the centre. Rommel's columns would drive north through El Guettar, while von Arnim's panzers punched west through Faid. The two would meet at Kasserine, then surge through Tebessa into Algeria, severing the Allied supply lines. If successful, they would trap tens of thousands of soldiers and perhaps change the entire course of the North African campaign. But Rommel faced his own limits. 3 years of desert warfare had drained him. He was sick, exhausted, and longing to go home. Von Arnim, a proud Prussian officer, saw Rommel as a rival and wanted the glory for himself. Overseeing both was Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, Smiling Al, the cheerful but calculating Luftwaffe commander who demanded a victory to erase the shadow of Stalingrad. "Our nation," Kesselring said, "is in desperate need of a triumph." While the Axis generals coordinated with precision, the Allied front was crumbling. American units were still scattered across vast stretches of desert, connected only by broken radio networks and blind faith. The British and French distrusted each other, and Fredendall's obsession with regulation slowed every movement. Engineers built roads and tunnels, but not fortifications. The weather worsened, bogging down supply trucks and grounding aircraft. Ammunition was low, morale even lower. Men complained of cold nights and endless sandstorms that clogged their rifles. The 1st Armoured Division, poorly trained for desert warfare, was already stretched thin, forced to cover miles of exposed passes without proper reconnaissance. In theory, the Allies held strong defensive ground along the eastern dorsal, a line of ridges and passes that guarded the path to Tunisia. In reality, it was a fragile front held by confusion, inexperience, and poor communication. And on the other side of those ridges, Rommel's tanks were already revving their engines. In the coming days, the quiet of the desert would shatter beneath the roar of steel. The Americans, untested and unprepared, were about to face a master of war who knew exactly how to exploit every weakness they had. By early February 1943, the calm before the storm settled uneasily over Tunisia. The soldiers of the United States 2nd Corps dug shallow foxholes into cold, stony ground, unaware that within days the desert would erupt around them. The wind howled through the passes, carrying the scent of rain and smoke, a warning of what was coming. At the Allied headquarters, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, recently promoted to 4-star general, began his inspection of the front lines. The intelligence from Ultra, the secret British code-breaking operation, had warned of an Axis offensive, but the details were wrong. Eisenhower's intelligence chief, Brigadier Erich Mockler-Ferryman, insisted the Germans would attack in the north, with only a small feint in the south. The real blow, however, was already forming just beyond the mountains of Faid and Kasserine. When Eisenhower arrived at the 2nd Corps sector, he was appalled. General Fredendall's headquarters sat buried deep underground in Speedy Valley, far from the fighting. From there, Fredendall issued endless, confusing orders to units spread thin across the desert. Instead of concentrating his armour for a counterattack, he had scattered tank battalions in what the British called penny packets. No minefields protected the passes, and many officers believed they had 2 full days before any German movement. Eisenhower's face hardened. "Well, maybe you don't know it," he told them coldly, "but we've learned in this war that once the Nazis take a position, they organise it for defence within 2 hours. Get your minefields out first thing in the morning." But his warning came too late. Officers nodded politely, soldiers relaxed in their foxholes, and the engineers went back to routine work. Even as Eisenhower decorated Lieutenant Colonel Thomas D. Drake for bravery, the men under Drake's command were already facing the storm that would test them to the limit. That night, the desert winds shifted. A dry, relentless gust swept in from the Sahara, erasing tracks, tearing at tents, and drowning out the sound of engines moving in the dark. To the east, the faint rumble of armour could already be heard, the first growl of Rommel's approaching army. The Americans believed they still had time. Rommel knew they didn't. February 14th, 1943, St. Valentine's Day. The desert awoke not to love, but to thunder. Before dawn, a chill wind from the Sahara swept through the valleys of Tunisia, carrying the first sounds of doom, the grinding of tank tracks and the low growl of engines. Then came the flash of muzzle fire, and the earth itself seemed to shudder. Rommel had unleashed his strike. 2 battalions of the 10th Panzer Division, supported by the massive Tiger I tanks of the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion, roared toward Fade Pass. Their 88mm guns spat flame across the ridges, each shell tearing through sandbags, armour and men alike. The Americans of Combat Command A, facing their first major German assault, scrambled to respond. Their positions were thin, their artillery uncoordinated, and their communication lines already faltering. In the confusion, Colonel John Waters, commanding the 1st Battalion, called in the only armour he had, 15 M3 Stuart tanks. Light, fast and hopelessly outmatched, they darted forward into the storm. Their 37mm shells pinged harmlessly against German steel. One by one they were blasted apart, burning wrecks dotting the desert like candles in a graveyard. The only way to hurt a Kraut with the 37, Fredendall had once joked, is to give him an enema with it. The grim laughter of headquarters now echoed as bitter irony. Waters found himself surrounded by more than 60 German vehicles. Overrun and out of ammunition, he radioed back, "Don't worry about me, we'll be all right. You get on with the war." Moments later, he and his men were captured. The irony was cruel. Waters was General George S. Patton's son-in-law. 2 years later, Patton would risk a disastrous raid to free him. The battle raged on. Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Hightower's 2nd Battalion rolled in with newly issued M4 Sherman tanks, their 75mm guns promising redemption. Instead, the Shermans were cut apart just as easily. A single German shell to the rear sprocket would immobilise them and ignite the fuel tanks. Flames burst skyward. Hightower's own tank Texas was hit and burned. He escaped with his crew, running through the sand as shells exploded around them. Panic spread like wildfire. Soldiers abandoned trucks, artillerymen fled their guns, and hundreds of GIs ran toward the rear shouting, "The Krauts are coming!" Officers drew their pistols to stop them, but discipline dissolved in the desert wind. Fuel dumps exploded as stray bullets ignited the reserves, and the sky filled with pillars of fire. By nightfall, the battlefield was a vision of hell. The Germans had destroyed 44 American tanks, 50 half-tracks, and 26 artillery pieces, capturing thousands of men. Nearly 200 vehicles lay in ruins across the sand. The 1st Armoured Division, once America's pride, had been broken open in a single day. What had begun as a test of strength had turned into a lesson in survival. For the Americans, Valentine's Day 1943 would forever be remembered not in roses and romance, but in smoke, steel, and defeat. As the sun rose on February 15th, 1943, the once organised front at Sidi Bou Zid dissolved into utter chaos. The German panzers pressed forward relentlessly, and what remained of the American defence began to unravel. Columns of black smoke curled into the morning sky as shattered vehicles burned, and the sand was littered with shell casings, twisted steel, and the bodies of men who had never fired a shot in anger before this day. In the command posts, confusion reigned. Brigadier General Raymond McQuillan, commanding Combat Command A, refused to believe what his own officers reported. When Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Drake phoned to say, "Your men are running away," McQuillan snapped, "They're only shifting positions." Drake's furious reply cut through the static. "Shifting positions, hell! I know panic when I see it." Across the desert, hundreds of soldiers fled their positions, throwing away helmets and weapons as they ran. Some stumbled through the dunes until they collapsed. Others were overtaken and captured by German patrols. Trucks jammed the narrow tracks leading west, drivers honking, shouting and cursing as tanks and jeeps tangled in desperate retreat. A captain pulled into the supply area and shouted, "Take off! You're on your own!" chaos consumed everything. The 2nd Battalion, 17th Field Artillery, was caught completely unprepared. German tanks tore through their gun lines, blasting howitzers apart at point-blank range. A nearby fuel depot erupted in flames as a major, fearing capture, riddled it with bullets to deny it to the enemy, infuriating tankers who needed the fuel to fight back. The explosions lit the desert for miles. By midday, Rommel's men had surrounded 2,000 Americans on Jebels Lasuda and Ksaira, 2 isolated hills that became pockets of hopeless resistance. Cut off and out of supplies, the defenders fought until their ammunition ran dry. Rommel's troops swept through Sidi Bouzid, capturing the town and destroying 50 tanks, 40 half-tracks, 30 artillery pieces, and more than 20 trucks in just 12 hours. The Germans' precision stunned even themselves. The Americans had been outgunned, outflanked, and outmaneuvered. For the first time, the German command realized how inexperienced their new enemy truly was. For the Americans, it was a brutal awakening, the worst defeat they would suffer in the entire European theatre. As night fell, the desert was silent again, lit only by burning wreckage. Eisenhower's 2 corps had been shattered, and in the darkness one thought echoed among the survivors. If this was how the first round ended, how many more could they endure? By the night of February 15th, 1943, the battlefield around Sidi Bouzid was unrecognisable. A wasteland of burning tanks, dead horses and shattered guns. The Germans had swept through with terrifying efficiency, leaving behind nothing but smoke and silence. For the American II Corps, it was a moment of reckoning. At headquarters, General Dwight D. Eisenhower received the first reports. They were worse than anyone had imagined. Entire battalions were missing. Communication lines had gone dead. And the men who were supposed to be leading, General Lloyd Fredendall and General Kenneth Anderson, were nowhere near the fighting. Eisenhower drove straight to Speedy Valley, Fredendall's underground fortress carved deep into the hills near Tebessa. Inside, he found a command post untouched by war. Maps were neatly pinned to walls, typewriters clicked in rhythm, and aides spoke in calm voices as if the front were miles away, which in truth it was. Fredendall greeted Eisenhower as if nothing were wrong, but everything was. Out of 5 American battalions in the area, 2 were surrounded and 3 were being obliterated. Fredendall had no clear picture of the situation and seemed to think the Germans were bluffing. His British superior, Anderson, believed the main Axis attack was still coming from the north. Both men were blind to the obvious. Rommel was carving straight through the centre. The only decision they made that night was to withdraw from several key positions, abandoning the airfields at Feriana and Telepte and the town of Gafsa. The retreat was so sudden that hundreds of soldiers left their supplies behind. In the confusion, one unlikely group refused to be left behind: Madame Lazonga and the 6 women who ran the local bordello. They begged American tankers for a ride, and soon laughter and shouts echoed through the chaos as they clung to the back of an M3 Stuart rumbling west. But the humour was short-lived. Fredendall's next counterattack from Speitler failed miserably. Out of 58 tanks that charged into the fight, only 4 returned. General Oliver Ward's units were gutted, losing 98 tanks, 57 half-tracks, and 29 artillery pieces in just 2 days. The once proud 1st Armoured Division was now little more than scattered survivors clinging to the edges of the desert. A single GI wandering through the battlefield later said, "The night had a dead silence except for a few howling dogs." Yet in headquarters, Fredendall remained oddly calm, reporting, "We might have walloped them, or they might have walloped us." Behind him, Eisenhower's patience was running out. The Allies had lost more ground in a week than they had gained in months. The Germans were advancing fast and the American command was collapsing faster. The coming days would decide whether the United States could recover or lose North Africa altogether. The German advance seemed unstoppable. Rommel's armour had smashed the American defences, captured towns and left a trail of wreckage stretching for miles. Yet, just as the momentum peaked, something unexpected happened. The Axis war machine hesitated. Inside their field headquarters, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and General Jürgen von Arnim clashed bitterly over what to do next. Rommel wanted to push west through Kasserine Pass, crush the retreating Americans, and seize the Allied supply depots at Tebessa. Von Arnim disagreed, arguing the terrain ahead was too rough for tanks, and that the real victory lay in attacking north. The disagreement was more than strategy. It was ego. Rommel, the desert legend, despised being second-guessed. Arnim, the aristocratic Prussian, considered Rommel reckless and overrated. Above them, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commander of all Axis forces in the region, listened impatiently. Germany had just suffered the disaster at Stalingrad, and Kesselring was desperate for a victory that could restore morale. After Stalingrad, he told his generals, our nation is badly in need of a triumph. But while Rommel and Arnim argued, precious time slipped away. For 2 days, German armour sat idle, engines cooling under the desert sun. Their delay was caused not only by pride, but by exhaustion. The tanks were running low on fuel, spare parts were scarce, and the long supply lines back to Tunisia were under constant attack from Allied aircraft. Far away in England, at Bletchley Park, British codebreakers intercepted the frantic radio traffic between Rommel and Arnim. They read every message but misread the meaning. Once again, Allied intelligence concluded that the next Axis attack would strike the north, when in reality, Rommel was already planning to throw everything he had toward Kasserine. For the Americans, this unexpected pause was a silent miracle. Broken units regrouped, scattered survivors found new positions, and reinforcements began to trickle in from the west. Engineers worked through the night to dig defences in the narrow defiles of the pass. Still, no one truly believed the storm was over. Every soldier knew that Rommel wasn't done. He was merely waiting for the moment to strike again. In his diary, Rommel wrote, I had never gambled, but now I must. A greater risk must be taken. The Desert Fox was about to make his boldest move yet, a strike through Kasserine that would decide the fate of North Africa. Night fell over the rugged hills of Kasserine Pass, a narrow mile-wide gap carved through the Grand Dorsalet Mountains, the last natural gateway between Tunisia and Algeria. The temperature dropped sharply, and the wind moaned through the rocks as exhausted American engineers from the 19th Combat Engineer Regiment dug in along the valley floor. They were road builders, not fighters, and most had never fired their rifles in battle. Yet now they stood as the thin line between Rommel's panzers and the Allied supply depots beyond. At 9 p.m. on February 17th, their orders were simple: hold the pass at all costs. The engineers set up roadblocks, rolled out barbed wire, and laid fresh anti-tank mines across the dirt road. But they had no picks or shovels to bury them. The mines lay exposed, glittering under the moonlight like a deadly welcome mat. In the distance, the faint rumble of engines echoed through the canyons. Rommel's vanguard was already approaching. Recognizing the danger, Major General Lloyd Fredendall finally made a rare sound decision. He called for reinforcements. From miles away, Colonel Alexander Stark and his men of the 26th Infantry Regiment, part of Terry de la Mesa Allen's 1st Infantry Division, began the long, freezing night march toward Kasserine. Fredendall's order to Stark was dramatic but vague. Pull a Stonewall Jackson, take over up there. It took Stark 12 exhausting hours to move his battalion through the darkness, mud and confusion. By dawn, his troops reached the pass, joining the engineers and a few French artillery crews, manning worn 75mm field guns, relics of the First World War. The men were cold, hungry and half asleep, but they were determined to fight. To the east, Rommel's tanks rolled closer, their silhouettes barely visible through the morning mist. At 4:50 a.m. on February 19th, the German artillery opened fire. The first shells slammed into the American positions, shaking the ground and splintering rocks across the slopes. The French 75s fired back, their crews working frantically to load and aim. To everyone's surprise, the old guns hit hard, knocking out several German tanks and momentarily halting the advance. But Rommel was not one to pause. He ordered his panzers to push through in a three-pronged attack, the Afrika Korps striking the centre of the pass, the 21st Panzer Division swinging north toward Le Kef, and the 10th Panzer Division waiting at Spitla as a mobile reserve. As the roar of engines filled the canyon, the ground shook beneath the Americans' boots. For the young soldiers clutching their rifles on the valley floor, the sound of those engines was the sound of death approaching. Still, they stood their ground. Against all odds, they would fight. February 19th, 1943. Dawn over Kasserine. The first light of day revealed the jagged ridges and narrow valley floor where the Americans had taken their stand. A cold mist clung to the rocks, muffling the sound of approaching engines. Then the silence broke. The thunder of artillery rolled across the pass as German guns opened fire. Shells screamed down into the valley, exploding among the engineers and infantry who clung to their foxholes. The French 75mm field guns replied with steady rhythm, their crews working furiously to load and fire. Each recoil kicked clouds of dust into the air, but their shells found targets. 5 German tanks burst into flame before the gunners were silenced by counterfire. The ground shook as Rommel's Afrika Korps advanced in a 3-pronged thrust, armour and infantry down the centre, the 21st Panzer Division swinging north toward Le Queff, and the 10th Panzer Division waiting at Spitler, ready to strike wherever resistance faltered. By mid-morning, the entire pass was engulfed in smoke and chaos. German Nabelwerfer rocket launchers, nicknamed Screaming Mimes by GIs, unleashed volleys that filled the air with a haunting wail. The psychological impact was devastating. Some Americans bolted from their trenches, their rifles dropped in the sand, only to be caught by MPs or enemy fire. Others fought stubbornly, holding positions until they were overrun. Colonel Alexander Stark's command post shook under the blast of shells. Radios spat static and broken cries for help. German machine gunners swept the slopes, while infantry slipped through the fog, bayonets glinting. When Stark finally realised his flanks were collapsing, he called for help, but there was none to send. The engineers beside him were road builders armed with carbines. They had done their duty. Now they were being slaughtered. By noon, the defenders were hanging on by instinct. The slopes of Kasserine were littered with burning vehicles, wrecked guns, and shattered bodies. The smell of fuel and death hung thick in the air. Still, a few pockets of resistance refused to yield, men firing until their rifles jammed, artillerymen dying beside their guns. As dusk fell, the German flag rose over the eastern mouth of the pass. Rommel's armour had broken through the first American line. Behind them, the 19th Engineers were gone, Stark's infantry scattered, and the road to Thala lay open. For the Allies, Kasserine Pass was no longer a defensive line. It was a wound, bleeding men and machines into the desert night. The morning of February 20th, 1943, dawned grey and cold over the Tunisian mountains. The once quiet valley of Kasserine now echoed with the grinding march of German armour. Rommel's columns pushed relentlessly west, their treads crushing the wreckage of American guns and vehicles as they advanced toward Tebessa, the vital supply hub that fed the entire Allied front. Behind them, the remnants of the American defenders stumbled through smoke and mud, retreating in exhaustion. The 19th Engineers were shattered, Colonel Stark's infantry scattered, and what little artillery remained was out of ammunition. For every mile Rommel gained, the Allied command fell deeper into confusion. In his bunker at El Kouif, General Lloyd Fredendall tried to maintain control, but his world was collapsing. Reports arrived too late or contradicted one another. Entire units had vanished without orders, communications were broken, and officers at the front stopped bothering to call. Eisenhower had sent observers to assess the situation, but even they couldn't find Fredendall. He was buried deep underground, far from the sound of guns. When one of Eisenhower's inspectors entered the bunker, he found Fredendall sitting on the steps, a glass of bourbon in hand, muttering, "If I were home, I'd go out and paint the garage doors. There's a lot of pleasure in painting a garage door." His aides watched in silence as their commander stared blankly at the map, as if willing the enemy to disappear. Meanwhile, the German advance gathered speed. Columns of Panzer IVs, half-tracks, and Italian Centauro tanks rolled through the shattered American lines. Supply trucks burst into flames as demolition crews detonated depots to keep them from falling into Axis hands. The sky turned black with smoke. More than 1 million rations, tons of ammunition, and thousands of gallons of fuel went up in explosions that shook the desert floor. On the ground, soldiers and civilians fled in chaos. French troops, American engineers, and Arab civilians crowded the roads, tangled with vehicles moving in every direction. Machine gun fire echoed from the ridges as German scouts harassed the retreating columns. By nightfall, the road to Tebessa lay open. Only scattered units stood between Rommel's panzers and the Allied supply dumps. To the Germans, it looked like victory was within reach. To the Americans, it was the brink of disaster. Yet amid the confusion, a new determination began to form. Far from the chaos of Fredendall's bunker, junior officers and battle-hardened survivors regrouped near the town of Thala. There, under the command of Brigadier General Paul Robinett and Major General Terry Allen, the Americans and British would prepare for a final stand, one that would decide whether North Africa was lost or saved. By the evening of February 20th, 1943, the once proud US Second Corps was on the brink of collapse. Rommel's tanks had broken through Kasserine Pass and were now thundering toward Thala, the last defensive barrier before Tebessa and the Allied supply depots. Behind them lay a trail of smoking wrecks and burning vehicles. Ahead, only a handful of exhausted men stood between Rommel and victory. At Thala, Brigadier General Paul Robinett of Combat Command B joined forces with Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen and his battle-hardened 1st Infantry Division, known as the Big Red One. They were joined by the British under Brigadier Charles Dunphy, commander of the 26th Armoured Brigade, whose tanks were already rolling into position. Between them, they gathered 8 battered battalions, Americans, British, French and even Senegalese riflemen, united by desperation. Robinett climbed onto a tank and looked out across the valley. "We'll fight here," he said simply, "in place." The ground they stood on, patchwork of olive groves, cactus farms and muddy ridges, would soon become one of the fiercest battlefields in North Africa. The Germans attacked first. Around 2 p.m, General Karl Bulovius hurled 40 panzers forward, their guns blazing as Italian Bersaglieri infantry followed in trucks, plumes on their helmets fluttering in the wind. But this time, the Americans were ready. Artillery thundered from the hills, pounding the attackers with deadly accuracy. Shells ripped through the German columns, forcing them to scatter for cover. Bulovius lacked enough heavy guns to strike back effectively, and by dusk 10 of his tanks burned in the valley while the Americans had lost only 1. Still, Rommel's army pressed on. When darkness fell, the sky opened in a cold rain, turning the ground to mud. The German flanking attack bogged down, their tanks stuck axle-deep in muck. Through the night, flare bursts illuminated men digging foxholes, shivering in wet uniforms. Before dawn, another assault came. Fog blanketed the field, and German forces captured Hill 812, along with several American howitzers. But at 9 a.m, the fog lifted, and the defenders unleashed hell. Brigadier General Clifton Andrus, the 1st Division's artillery commander, called it an artilleryman's dream. Dozens of American and British guns opened fire at once, raining destruction on Rommel's tanks and infantry below. The valley floor erupted in fire. By mid-afternoon, the German advance had stalled. Tanks burned across the fields and scattered Axis soldiers fled for cover. Rommel, watching from the ridgeline, knew the truth. His offensive had reached its limit. His men were exhausted, his supplies almost gone, and the Allied line at Thala still held. As the rain fell and the guns finally went silent, the soldiers at Thala realised they had done what none before them had. They had stopped Rommel. The cost had been terrible, but for the first time since the battle began, the Americans no longer ran. They fought and they held. February 21st, 1943, dawn at Thala. The rain had stopped, but the battlefield was a sea of mud and wreckage. Broken panzers smouldered in the valley below, their twisted hulls reflecting the pale morning light. The exhausted Allied troops, caked in dirt and soot, tightened their grips on rifles and waited for what they knew would come, Rommel's final push. At first, the sound was distant, a faint grinding of gears echoing through the fog, then it grew into a roar. The 10th Panzer Division advanced again, determined to break through the Allied line. German artillery hammered the ridges, while Rommel himself directed the attack from his forward command car, shouting orders through the din. His army was bloodied but not yet beaten. Then, from the west, salvation arrived. Brigadier General Stafford Erwin, commander of the 9th Infantry Division's artillery, had driven his men 735 miles in 4 gruelling days across Tunisia's broken roads. His 48 heavy guns rolled into position at sunrise, forming a 3-mile arc along the high ground above Thala. Erwin, a calm professional who had once studied art and poetry at West Point, gave the order quietly. Fire for effect! The earth erupted. Dozens of howitzers thundered in unison, their shells whistling over the valley. Within moments, the German advance disintegrated under a storm of steel. Tanks exploded, trucks overturned, and infantry scattered in panic. Brigadier Clifton Andrus called it an artilleryman's dream. Targets everywhere. Perfect range, perfect visibility. Rommel's radio crackled with desperate reports. Ammunition was nearly gone. Fuel reserves were down to a few hundred gallons, and his men were running on exhaustion and fear. His attack on Thala had stalled completely. By noon, even the Desert Fox knew the truth. He had lost the initiative. At 2 p.m, the Afrika Korps began to pull back, leaving behind burning armour and hundreds of dead. American and British forces cautiously advanced, collecting prisoners and salvaging wrecks. For the first time in the North African campaign, the US Army had stood its ground against Germany's best. Rommel watched the smoke rising over Thala and turned to his aide. "It appears futile to continue," he said quietly. "We have reached our limit." The order went out. Withdrawal to Spitla. The Battle of Kasserine Pass, once a symbol of humiliation, was about to become the turning point in America's education in war. When the guns finally fell silent on February 23, 1943, the desert was quiet again. A grim, haunted silence broken only by the wind drifting over the dead. The once green soldiers of the US Second Corps walked among the ruins of Kasserine Pass, staring at the wreckage of their first great battle. Burned-out tanks lined the roads. Artillery pieces lay overturned, their barrels twisted from heat. The air reeked of oil, smoke, and something no man could ever forget. The cost was staggering. The Allies had lost nearly 10,000 men, 6,500 Americans killed, and thousands more wounded or captured. 183 tanks, 194 half-tracks, 208 artillery pieces, and over 500 trucks and jeeps were gone. The German toll was lighter, about 2,000 casualties, but their victory had come at a price. They were out of fuel, out of supplies, and forced to retreat toward Tunisia. Rommel's army had proven its brilliance one last time, but it could not hold what it had taken. In the American command, accountability came swiftly. Eisenhower, furious at the chaos and leadership failures, sent Major General Ernest Harmon to assess the situation. Harmon found Fredendall hiding in his bunker, defeated in body and spirit. "He's no damned good," Harmon reported bluntly to Eisenhower, "a physical and moral coward." Within days, Fredendall was relieved of command. Eisenhower promoted him only to send him home, a quiet exile wrapped in polite ceremony. Historians would later be less kind, calling him one of the most inept senior officers to hold a high command in World War II. In the ruins of the past, the lessons of Kasserine began to take root. The Americans learned the hard truth. Bravery alone was not enough. Discipline, coordination and leadership would win wars, not chaos and arrogance. Units were retrained, communication systems rebuilt, and command structures reorganized. The next time these soldiers met the Germans, they would not run. For Ernie Pyle, the war correspondent who had walked among the wreckage, the story was not one of shame, but of awakening. "There is nothing wrong with the common American soldier," he wrote. "His spirit is good. The deeper he gets into a fight, the more of a fighting man he becomes." Kasserine Pass was a defeat, but it was also a beginning. Out of humiliation came discipline, out of chaos came unity. The men who had stumbled through Tunisia would soon march across Sicily, storm Normandy's beaches, and push into Germany itself. The Americans had met Rommel, and though they had fallen, they had learned. In the endless dunes of North Africa, amid the wreckage of Chaos Pass, the US Army was reborn. The sun set slowly over the mountains of Tunisia, its fading light casting long shadows over the battlefield that had tested an army's soul. The scorched earth of Kasserine Pass was silent now, littered with rusted shells, burnt helmets, and the twisted remains of what had once been the pride of America's first great armoured force. The wind carried the last echoes of battle through the dunes, whispering the story of the young soldiers who had faced fear, chaos, and defeat, and endured. For the Americans, Kasserine was more than a battle. It was a baptism. In just 9 days, the US Army had been stripped of its illusions. Commanders learned that war could not be directed from bunkers, and soldiers learned that courage meant standing firm when everything around them fell apart. The lessons written in the sand of Tunisia would reshape an entire generation of warriors. In the months that followed, those same men, The ones who had fled from Rommel's panzers would rise again under stronger leadership. Eisenhower reorganized the command, promoted officers who led from the front, and forged a fighting force that learned, adapted, and struck back. By summer, those same troops would storm Sicily, push through Italy, and one day march across Normandy's beaches toward victory in Europe. Even Field Marshal Rommel, though victorious at Kasserine, sensed what was coming. The Americans, he told his staff, learn quickly, give them time, and they will be dangerous. He was right. For those who survived, Kasserine never left them. They remembered the smoke-filled skies, the scream of rockets, and the feeling of helplessness in the face of the Desert Fox's genius. Yet they also remembered something else, that in the furnace of failure they had found resilience. In the quiet after the storm, the desert kept its secrets. But history remembered. Kasserine Pass was not just the story of a defeat, it was the story of a beginning. From its ashes rose the fighting spirit that would carry America through Sicily, Normandy, and beyond. The men who walked away from Chaos Pass carried scars, but also strength. In the dust and fire of Tunisia, they learned what every army must learn, that the road to victory begins with survival. And on that road, forged in loss, America's army became unstoppable. The Battle of Kasserine Pass, where chaos turned to courage and defeat became the first step toward triumph.